I was stuck. No cell signal, no radio response, just me and the patrolman who had shown up out of nowhere. He stood right outside my window, motionless, staring in at me with those dead eyes. I couldn't breathe. Then he knocked, slow, deliberate, 3 taps. But his hand wasn't right. It wasn't even a hand anymore. It looked clawed. It started like any other night shift. My name's Kelly, and I drive a tow truck. I'm used to strange calls at odd hours, pulling people out of all kinds of trouble. But this one was different. I got a distress call about a car that had broken down in the middle of Highway 16. If you know the area, you know that stretch of road is, well, there's nothing out there. No lights, no signs of life. Just miles of cold, dark highway cutting through the mountains. The guy on the phone sounded terrified, said his car had died right in the middle of the road, and he had no idea what to do. His voice was shaky, desperate, like something else was going on, something he didn't want to say. I told him to hang tight, that I'd be there as fast as I could. I floored it. I didn't want to leave anyone stranded out there longer than they needed to be. When I arrived, I spotted the car right where he said it'd be, dead in the center of the highway, engine still smoking like it had just given up on life. But here's the thing. There was no driver, just an empty car sitting there like it had been abandoned. The guy who'd called me? Gone. Not a trace of him. I walked around the car, calling out into the dark. "Hello? Anyone out here?" My voice echoed back to me, swallowed by the eerie silence of the night. No rustling in the woods, no footsteps, no sign of life at all. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. It was unnatural. That's when I saw it. A patrol car, parked a little up the road. Relief washed over me for a second. I figured maybe the driver got picked up by a cop. Finally, someone who could help explain this whole mess. But as I walked toward the patrol car, I noticed something off. The car was old. I mean really old, like it hadn't been on duty for decades. And then I saw him, walking toward me. Tall, gaunt, wearing an old-fashioned uniform that looked out of place, even for a small town like ours. His face was pale, with deep-set eyes that seemed like they hadn't seen sleep in years. The name tag on his chest read Tomlin. "Officer Tomlin," he said, his voice flat and almost mechanical. There was something strange about the way he spoke, like he was going through the motions but wasn't really there. I asked him if he'd seen the driver, and he just shook his head, barely acknowledging me. His eyes, God, those eyes. They were too dark, too deep, like they didn't belong in a living person. A cold chill ran up my spine, but I pushed the feeling down. I had a job to do. I turned back to the car, hooking it up to my truck, but I could feel his eyes on me the entire time, watching, unblinking. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, but I couldn't just leave the car. I kept working, my hands moving faster than usual, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally looked back to ask him again about the driver, he was gone. Just gone. His patrol car was still there, but Tomlin had disappeared into the night without a sound. My pulse kicked into overdrive. I scanned the road, yelling out into the dark, but the only thing I could hear was the faint hum of the highway and my own heavy breathing. Then my radio went haywire. Static filled the truck, loud and grating, mixed with strange, garbled voices that sounded like they were trying to speak but couldn't. I grabbed the radio, trying to make sense of it, but it was just wrong. I couldn't explain it, but it wasn't like any interference I'd ever heard. And then I saw him again. Tomlin, standing just a few feet from my truck, staring at me. But this time, something had changed. His eyes were darker, almost hollow, like he wasn't even human anymore. My hands started shaking and I struggled to breathe. My mind raced, trying to figure out if I was imagining this. But no, he was real. Too real. Without thinking, I jumped into the truck and floored it. The car I was towing felt like dead weight, dragging behind me, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. My hands were slick with sweat, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it might explode. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Tomlin standing in the middle of the road, but he wasn't there. Just darkness. When I made it back to town, I went straight to the sheriff's office. My words were tumbling out of me, all jumbled and frantic as I tried to explain what had just happened. The broken-down car, the patrolman, Tomlin. The sheriff listened, his face growing paler with every word. When I mentioned Tomlin's name, he froze. "Kelly," he whispered, his voice shaky. "Officer Tomlin died over 30 years ago, hit and killed by a car while helping a stranded motorist on that same stretch of highway." My blood ran cold. Whatever I had seen out there, it wasn't human. It couldn't be. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going back to that highway anytime soon. Not if Tomlin's still out there, waiting for the next stranded driver. It was about a week after the first encounter. I was just getting back into a normal rhythm, convincing myself it had all been in my head. That's when I got another call. Another stranded car, same highway, same empty stretch of road where nothing good ever happens. For a split second I hesitated. My hand froze over the ignition, knuckles white. Part of me wanted to refuse, say I couldn't do it. But this is what I do. I'm Kelly, the tow truck driver. People call me when they're in trouble and I show up, even if that means facing him again. I started the truck and headed out, but this time it felt different. The drive itself seemed darker, the shadows clinging to the edges of the road like they were alive. It was oppressive, like the highway itself had teeth, waiting to swallow me whole. The closer I got to the scene, the more I could feel it. That pressure, that heavy silence pressing down on me. When I arrived, the scene was all too familiar. Another car, dead in the middle of the road, its engine completely fried. But this time, I wasn't alone. A young woman was pacing beside the car, wringing her hands, her breath coming out in short, panicked bursts. Her name was Jessica, 20-something, pale, and clearly terrified. She said the car had just died on her, no warning, nothing. I could see the fear in her eyes, but she wasn't just scared of the car breaking down. There was something else, something she wasn't saying. I tried to calm her down, but I could barely manage to calm myself. My mind was racing, scanning the road, the trees, the shadows. I kept expecting to see him, Tomlin, step out from the darkness. It was like he was watching us, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal himself. I knew he'd show up eventually. I got to work, hooking up her car, but every sound felt too loud, too close. The silence around us was so thick it was suffocating, and that's when it happened again. My radio cut out just like before. Static filled the air, louder this time, aggressive, like it was trying to drown out everything else. Jessica looked at me, her eyes wide with terror. "Is someone out there?" she asked, her voice shaking. She was looking around like she could feel it too, like something was watching us. I didn't want to scare her any more than she already was, but I couldn't lie either. "I don't know," I muttered, barely able to keep the tremor out of my voice. But inside I was screaming. I knew what was out there. And then she gasped, her finger pointing into the darkness. "There's someone over there," she whispered, her voice barely audible. My stomach dropped. I turned, and sure enough, standing just beyond the reach of the headlights, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, hollow eyes locked onto us. It was Tomlin. I froze. My heart slammed against my chest, and for a moment I couldn't move. He didn't move either, just stood there, watching us with those dead eyes. No blinking, no breathing, just staring. Jessica was starting to panic, backing away from the car, her hands shaking. I grabbed her arm, trying to keep her close, but inside I was losing it. I had no idea what to do. How do you stop something that's already dead? Tomlin took a step forward. It was slow, deliberate. The air around us seemed to grow colder with every step he took, like he was draining the warmth out of the night. I could hear Jessica's breath coming in sharp gasps beside me, and I was right there with her. "Stop!" I yelled, my voice cracking. But he didn't react. He just kept coming, his eyes locked on us, unblinking. I knew if he got any closer, something terrible would happen. I didn't know what, but I wasn't about to find out. Without thinking, I grabbed Jessica and pulled her toward the truck. We dove inside, and I slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the truck into gear. I hit the gas, and we sped down the highway, Jessica's car dragging behind us like a dead weight. I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there he was. Tomlin, standing in the middle of the road, watching us speed away. His figure grew smaller and smaller, but I knew he wasn't gone. Not really. He was still there, waiting for the next unlucky driver. When we got back to town, I went straight to the sheriff's office. I wasn't in the mood to explain it all again, but I had to. This time, the sheriff didn't doubt me. He didn't brush it off like he had before. His face was grim, his voice low. "You're not the first to see him," he said, and that chilled me to the bone. "Tomlin's been out there for years, decades even. But some things are beyond us." "What am I supposed to do?" I asked, desperate for an answer, any answer that could make this stop. The sheriff just shook his head, his eyes dark with something that looked like fear. "You can't stop it, Kelly. Some things can't be explained, and some things can't be stopped." That was it. No explanation, no solution, just Tomlin, out there, haunting that same stretch of highway, waiting for the next poor soul to cross his path. And now, every time I get a call for Highway 16, I feel it, that knot in my stomach, that creeping dread, because I know he's still out there, and one day he'll come for me again. I swear, when I looked back in my rearview mirror, his face wasn't human anymore. The skin seemed to stretch unnaturally, like it was barely holding together, and his eyes, those eyes, were all wrong. Too wide, too empty, and his mouth was twisted into this grotesque grin, like he knew something I didn't. It wasn't just his face. It was the way he moved too, almost gliding, too quick for a man. I don't even know how he caught up with me. There hadn't been another car for miles, yet there he was, standing right in the middle of the highway, as if waiting for me. I floored it, heart pounding, barely daring to blink. The last thing I remember before I shot past was his wave, slow, deliberate, and haunting. It was supposed to be a quick drive to my parents' place. I'd done the trip dozens of times before, cruising down the long, desolate roads of Nevada's desert. There's something almost peaceful about the isolation, the stretch of highway cutting through nothing but sand and sky. That night, though, it felt different. The darkness seemed thicker, like it was pressing in on me. I had hours to go, and the idea of driving through that emptiness didn't sit right with me. Still, I wasn't about to turn back. It all started just after midnight. I wasn't speeding, wasn't distracted, just gliding along when the flash of red and blue lights lit up behind me. At first, I was confused. There were no other cars around, and I couldn't think of a reason I'd be pulled over. Still, I did the responsible thing and slowed down, pulling over to the side of the road. The patrol car stopped behind me, and a figure emerged. As he approached my window, I could see he was an older man, middle-aged, with deep lines etched into his face. His name tag read Officer Wilkes. He looked normal, at least on the surface, maybe a bit tired, like he'd been working too many long shifts. His uniform was slightly rumpled, his cap pulled low over his brow, but it was his eyes that struck me. They didn't seem to focus, not really. They weren't looking at me. They were looking through me, like I wasn't even there. He asked for my license and registration in this flat, emotionless voice, his words almost robotic. I handed them over, more out of reflex than anything. He barely acknowledged me, took the documents, and walked back to his cruiser. I watched him in the mirror. He didn't get back into his car right away. He just stood there by the side of the road, staring at my car. Not moving, not checking anything, just standing there. It made my skin crawl. After what felt like an eternity, he finally walked back, handed me my papers without a word, and disappeared into the night. That should have been the end of it. Just a strange cop on a lonely road, right? But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My rearview mirror kept drawing my eyes like I was expecting to see those red and blue lights again, but every time I checked, there was nothing, just the empty road behind me. And yet, the sense of being watched clung to me, heavy and cold. Then a few hours later, it happened. A flash in my mirror, just for a second. I looked back, and the road was empty. I chalked it up to my nerves. Maybe I was just tired, I told myself. But then I saw him. Officer Wilkes. Standing by the side of the road, staring at me as I passed. No car, just him, standing there like he had every right to be. At first I convinced myself it was a coincidence. Maybe he was patrolling the area. But as the night wore on, things got stranger. The temperature inside my car dropped. Not just a little. It was freezing, so cold I could see my breath fogging the windshield. My dashboard lights flickered, and the radio started crackling, even though I hadn't touched it. And then I saw him again. Always on the side of the road, always staring. Every few miles, there he was. Panic started to set in. I pressed harder on the gas, desperate to put some distance between us. But it didn't matter how fast I went. He kept appearing, closer each time, until finally he wasn't on the side of the road anymore. He was standing right in the middle of it. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just feet from him. His face, illuminated by my headlights, was twisted into that horrifying grin. His hand slowly raised and he waved, as if to signal me forward. That's when I saw it. His skin, stretched and pale, like it was barely holding his face together. His eyes, wide and empty, locked onto mine, and I felt a chill run through my entire body. That was the moment I realized this thing wasn't human. I did the only thing I could. I floored it, swerving around him, heart racing as I sped into the night. When I finally looked back in my mirror, he was gone. Days later, after the terror had subsided a bit, I told a local about what I'd seen. He didn't look surprised. He told me the story of Officer Wilkes. Apparently, he'd died on this stretch of highway years ago, hit by a drunk driver while on duty. Since then, people had reported seeing him at night, appearing out of nowhere. But here's the thing. Those who see him say he only lets you go after he's had a good look at you. Maybe he's making sure you're not a danger, or maybe he's just lonely. But that last wave, that grin, I'll never forget it.